Today, we are delighted to have Tricia Ebarvia. Tricia is an anti-bias, anti-racist literacy educator who is also a co-founder of Disrupt Text and 31 Days IBPOC. And she is co-founder of the Institute for Racial Equity in Literacy. Before her current role as the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at an independent school in Philadelphia, Tricia taught high school English for 20 years and served as department chairperson. Tricia is also a Corwin literacy author. Her new book, Get Free, Anti-Bias Literacy Instruction for Stronger Readers, Writers, and Thinkers, will be available in just about 2 weeks, as I said, publishing on October 17th, and is the focus of today's webinar. So now I will turn it over to our presenter, Tricia Ebarvia.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. I'm going to get started because, like most teachers, I overplan, and I think I have about 90 minutes worth of material for the next 50 minutes. So I want to start by sharing with you a peek into my practice, or my past practice. This was my classroom of 20 years. It didn't always look like this, but this is the most recent picture I have before I left to take on this new school leadership role. And I share this because it's, being a teacher and being a teacher at heart is everything to me. It's who I am. It's really an integral part of my identity. I also bring into this space, so of course, all the kids I've ever taught. So you can see me in there. And now, of course, I have littler kids that I get to talk to. You can see those pre-K students who are amazing. And you'd be surprised, but there's not that much difference, or I should say, there are big differences, but there's also some things that are still the same, whether you're 4 years old or 17 years old. You just want to find out what is going on in the world. You're trying to figure out who you are, and especially who you are in relationships to other people. So I bring every student I've ever had with me into this webinar. Of course, I also bring in my wonderful colleagues in my school, in my past schools across the country, people that I've gotten to meet and be in community with. Some of them are on here tonight, so that's really exciting. I see you, so thank you. And then personally, of course, I bring my family. You can see there's a cool picture of my parents in the 70s. That's them in the Philippines and on their honeymoon. You can't see the entire picture, but if I were to if you saw the full shot of my parents right there, you'd see that my dad is wearing very cool bell-bottom pants in the 70s. And if you looked even closer and zoomed, you could see the sideburns on him. And then there's my family right there, the picture we took this past summer, my partner of, oh my gosh, 20 years now, and our 3 kids. So I bring all of them, and really a really feeling of gratitude to this space with all of you tonight. I also want to say that I have the chat up, and there are people monitoring the chat. So as I like an active chat, so if you are someone who learns that way and likes to participate in that way, please do. I love seeing comments, and I'll save the chat later, so it'll be good feedback for me. And then we'll take questions at the end. Okay. All right. Let's see. So first, I start the book actually with a little confession that I had. So many years ago, I read this book, and if you've read this book, you can go ahead and say that in the chat too, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. And when I first read it in high school, I loved it. Now, those of you who are familiar with my work know that I am of the Disrupt Text crew, and one of the things we do is really challenge and think about like the canon, and is the canon, in what way is the canon perpetuating sort of a white European point of view? And now many years ago, when I first read Jane Eyre, when I was a high school student, I wasn't thinking in those ways. I was just thinking about how I love the story, about this main character. And the main character, Jane, was somebody who in some ways was kind of like me, who was sort of bookish, worked hard, kind of awkward socially. And I identify with that, right? I was like, okay, that's me. And then she, of course, it's the classic story in some ways of the girl who falls in love with a quote unquote bad boy. And I put that in big, huge quotes, this mysterious Rochester. And I found myself rooting for the romance the entire time. And there's this conflict between her and, reason and passion. Should she follow her passion, or she should listen to reason? It's in some ways a very classic story, classic again in quotes. When I went to college, though, and someone already mentioned it in the chat, I then read Jean Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea, which tells the story of Jane Eyre, but not from Jane's perspective, but actually from the perspective of Rochester's wife. Yes, Rochester, if you don't, spoiler, if you were planning to read Jane Eyre, I apologize. But Rochester has a wife, or had a wife, and she is upstairs. He's locked her up in his attic of his English manor. Yes, that's right. And she's treated very much as like sort of this other in the original book. And what Jean Rhys does is she really centers who, she gives her the name Antoinette, who Antoinette was before meeting Rochester. And she's considered sort of this mad woman. That idea of the mad woman in the attic comes from Jane Eyre, the novel, and really centers her perspective. You know, she's someone from the Caribbean, so she's also a woman of color. And it really made me see and think about how, when I had read Jane Eyre, I had only seen Antoinette, or Bertha, as she's called by Charlotte Bronte, as an obstacle. That I had only seen her as an obstacle that was in the way of Jane and her relationship with Rochester, right? That's the only, I just dismissed her in my mind. And it wasn't until I read Wide Sargasso Sea that I read this counter narrative that I thought, oh, wait a minute. What is going on here that I was able, or what was it about me and my experience and my own socialization that allowed me to kind of dismiss her and just see her as this obstacle? I mean, while it's a fictional story, I also don't want to be the type of person to dismiss anyone, even if it's a fictional character. And, you know, there's other things, you know, a few years later, I would read this essay, Reading Jane Eyre While Black. And you can, if you're interested, you can look at this essay online. But Tyrese Coleman talks about the fact that, you know, the way in which Bertha, Antoinette, is described in Jane Eyre, the character, there's these sort of tropes around Blackness and dark skin. And there wasn't the escapism allowed for a Black reader in reading this book. And, you know, as I read that sort of criticism and that thought, and I had escaped into Jane Eyre when I first read it, and I thought to myself, like, what is it about my experiences? What was it about how I've been socialized that what was my privilege that I could escape into Jane Eyre when I was a teenager? And how is that different for different readers, right? So this was sort of the beginning of me sort of thinking about this idea and the importance of counter narratives and how important that is. And also to think about more critically, this question of who is the I who reads, right? Who is the I who reads? And what values, beliefs, experiences, and biases, therefore, did I bring to my reading? And that's the essential question here. You know, I think we've all had kids every now and then who talk about books that they've read, or, you know, I still do, like we do a lot of independent reading at my school, and I did for many years. And I would always ask kids, you know, if you like this book or didn't like this book. And I would kind of leave our conversation at that, but we'd never interrogate where that like or dislike is coming from, right? And the thing is with kids, I mean, they're kids, they tend to attribute whether or not they liked or disliked something to the text without turning it back on themselves and thinking, well, wait a minute, what is it about me and what values, beliefs, and experiences and biases am I bringing here? So it's not about the text, that it's about something else that's happening, right? Because reading is that interaction, the beautiful interaction that happens between the text and the reader. So when I think about my socialization, who was the I who read Jane Eyre the first time around? It was someone who was socialized into Cinderella stories, right? I mean, I can't think about a time, I don't know a pre-Cinderella time, like that trope in my mind. I was also someone who, and I'm both dating myself and confessing lots of things right now. But when I was growing up, and if you have read these books, then you know, these were also some of the books that I was socialized into, right? The Sweet Valley High books, this idea of, you know, there's a twins, and of course the twins, there was a bad twin and a good twin, and it was all about their adventures as like young teenage girls. And what I realized much later, that I was reading actually Sweet Valley High as sort of this this interesting sort of window into what it meant to be a teenage girl. You know, I read them when I was in middle school, but not just a teenage girl, but a teenage girl who was well, white teenage girls, actually what I should say, right? That I kind of read them trying to look around. I was an introvert. Books were my way of thinking about the world. And so these were some of the schema that I was bringing when I was reading Jane Eyre. And then, of course, I shared that picture of my parents before. My parents were immigrants. This central conflict in Jane Eyre around reason versus passion. I told you earlier that one of the reasons that I was attracted to Jane Eyre was because she was like working hard and she was kind of awkward and she put her head down and, did the job. And that was very much something that aligned with my own upbringing, right? With my own parents and this idea that if you work hard and if you do all the right things, you will eventually be rewarded, right? I mean, isn't that the Cinderella story, right? And that was the story in Jane Eyre. And it's the one that I didn't realize I had been listening to and affected by both in the larger media, but then also in my reading in school. So I share all this to say that when we think about reading, we have to think about it in a way that's really responsive and conscious of all the messiness, the beautiful messiness that we bring to every experience, because we're messy people. That's what human beings are. So it's not just who is the I who reads and what values, beliefs, experiences, and biases, but also what does how I read reflect who I am in the world? And we'll start here. So part of the work that I've really been doing over the last few years is really thinking about this idea of a liberatory consciousness. And I'm going to quote a little bit at length here from Dr. Barbara Love, because she was such an essential part of my thinking and how we might apply this to literacy. So a liberatory consciousness enables humans to live their lives in oppressive systems and institutions with awareness and intentionality, rather than on the basis of the socialization to which they have been subjected. A liberatory consciousness enables humans to maintain an awareness of the dynamics of oppression characterizing society, but without giving in to despair and hopelessness about that condition. To maintain an awareness of the role played by each individual in the maintenance of that system without blaming them for the roles that they play, and at the same time, practice intentionality about changing systems of oppression. So what a liberatory consciousness means is that we're aware of the dynamics of oppression around us. So I'm very much aware that I've been socialized in ways that have harmed others, not intentionally, right? Like I think about my choices in where I live. I think about the choices in what I buy. I think about, just my own consciousness around reading that book, right? Jane Eyre, and seeing it and how I was able to ignore Bertha. And I think about that and I can see and I can be aware of it, right? And I can be aware of the way each of us, my students, my colleagues, the government, my spouse, my parents, my children, like I think about how all of us are playing a role in actually maintaining that system in some way, right? And I can also practice disrupting it and changing it. And doing it in a way that doesn't give in to despair, right? So you can see what's going on around you. And instead of feeling like, oh gosh, it's too much, I can't do anything, we say, okay, now that I see, I can do something about it. So a liberatory consciousness enables humans to live outside the patterns and thoughts and behavior learned through this process that helps to perpetuate oppressive systems. Right? What are the patterns and thoughts and behavior that we have learned? And how do we live outside of that? How do we see it for what it is, sort of pull back the curtain, and then make intentional decisions to do something different? And I think we can do that in schools, obviously. Schools are amazing places that can be places where we can free ourselves of these systems. And we can do that especially in the literature classroom, because the literature classroom is about imagination, right? A liberatory consciousness is about imagining something better. And we have a tremendous opportunity as literature teachers, as reading and writing teachers, to have kids do that reimagining in our classrooms. Okay, so just a quick overview. Since this is recorded, I know you can go back and review, so I'm not going to read all of these things, but of course, liberatory consciousness has 4 stages. The first stage is awareness, just noticing what's around us, right? Starting to pay attention to our language, thoughts, behaviors. It's a waking position. Then we move to the next stage, which is analysis. Okay, now that we notice these things, now we start asking what needs to be done. We consider all the different possibilities, right? We start thinking about like, why was someone ignored? How did demographics get that way? Why aren't there more teachers of color? Why did I so easily dismiss Bertha Antoinette in my first reading of Jane Eyre? Why did that happen? Why do I identify with certain types of characters and dismiss others? Why do I not see the characters who are at the margins of books, right? What does that mean? How I've been socialized to ignore certain people, right? So I start to ask questions. And then based on this awareness, then we move to the next stage, which is action, right? That any individual action makes possible collective liberation for any and all. And I love that hopefulness, right? And the ambition behind that, right? Any individual action makes possible collective liberation for any and all, right? Every moment we can interrupt, every moment we do something a little bit differently, every time we take action, right? Even something like as simple as, okay, we'll read Jane Eyre, but I had a wonderful college professor who said, and we're going to read Weitzerg SOC. And we're going to question what is Reese trying to get us to think about. So even that as an action, even though I didn't know it back then, was a moment in my important timeline of becoming aware, of becoming liberated in my thinking. And then finally, of course, always thinking about how we might be in loving accountability and allyship partners, right, with others who are different from us and who can provide us perspectives we also desperately need, right? Okay. So again, living outside those thoughts and patterns. This little QR code is for Barbara Love's essay, which you can read online. Okay, so what does it mean to teach outside and against our biases? So first, I'll just define what bias is, because I think sometimes we say, oh, you're just biased, right? But the truth is, biases are something that we have. All right, so we're going to do a quick little experiment, and I really want you to pay attention to what you're thinking and feeling as you do these next set of questions. So if you have a piece of paper, you can take the little piece of paper and just jot some things down. We're going to do this quickly, okay? So I'm not going to give you much time. I'm going to read the question, and you're going to listen to your brain. Where does your brain take you? Okay. All right. So here's the first question. And I'm so sorry. This is math. It's not a math webinar. You didn't come from this, but here we go. A bat and a ball costs $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Quickly in the chat, write down what your first, don't worry about being right or wrong. Just what is the first answer that comes to mind? Go ahead. I see 10 cents. Excellent. Thank you. All right. We're not even thinking. We're just looking at the problem. Amazing. Okay. Great job. Next one. If it takes 5 machines, 5 minutes to make 5 widgets, how long would it take 100 machines to make 100 widgets? Again, first answer that comes to mind. Not worry about right or wrong. What's the first answer that comes to mind? Okay. 100, 5, 100, 1. Multiplication, thinking 100. Okay. All right. Okay. There's a little bit more variety in that one, but I did see a couple of the same types of answers. 25. Okay. All right. Here's the next one. In a lake, there's a patch of lily pads. Every day, the patch doubles in size. If it takes 48 days for the patch to cover the entire lake, how long would it take for the patch to cover half the lake? All right, go ahead. Really quickly. First answer that just comes to mind. First answer that just comes to mind. Don't worry about if it's right or wrong. If it's 48 days to cover the entire thing, how long would it take to cover half the lake? Okay. All right. In some ways, this is the best audience because I'm not going to make assumptions that just because you're like interested in literacy and English that you might not be good at math, even though that was the case for me. But I'm sure I'm going to make the assumption that many of you haven't really thought about math-like problems. Didn't come here thinking you were going to do math problems. Okay. So I want to say a couple things here. So the answer that most of you said for number 1 was 10 cents. And I would guess that you probably got to 10 cents because you thought $1, $1.10, the difference is 10 cents. That was the first thing that came to mind. And you felt your brain going there. In fact, you probably had to consciously stop your brain from saying 10 cents because the correct answer is 5 cents. in order to do like the actual algebra. Now, if you did 5 cents, said 5 cents, I did see someone said 5 cents, so you did the math correctly. But notice many more people said 10 cents. And when I look at that problem, I think 10 cents. Okay, this is not, you can go back and look to see why the math works that way, but 5 cents is the correct answer, but most of us wanted to say 10. For the second one, if it takes 5 minutes, 5 machines, 5 minutes to make 5 widgets, how long would it take 100 machines? This is about rate of change. It would take 5 minutes. The rate doesn't change, even if you have 100 machines or 100 widgets. The rate of making these is the same, but many people, some said 20 because you divided 100 by 5. And then some of you said 100, right? Because that 5 machines, 5 minutes, 5 widgets, 100, 100, 100. You were thinking about that pattern. Notice the way your brain just kind of went there, right? You didn't even do any thinking. Your brain just kind of wanted to say that answer. And then in the last one, the correct answer is 47, but there were people who said 24 because the easiest math to do in that problem is to go 48. What is half of 48? Because the word half is in there. And you were like, okay, 24. Now, think about that for a second, this little experiment. And these are not my problems. These are actually from Amos and Tversky in the book, Thinking Fast and Slow, all about these cognitive biases. Your brain wanted, it took this like quick shortcut to get to these answers, right? And you actually have to stop consciously to say, okay, what is the correct answer? When I do this in class with kids, excuse me, I have them do it by themselves, and then I make them check with a partner, okay? And when they check with a partner, sometimes one of two things happens. Either they both have the incorrect answer that they got too quickly, and they're both like, oh, we must both be right. Or they look at the problem again. They think to themselves, why is she asking us to look at it again with a partner? They slow down, and then they arrive at the correct answer because they know, like, I'm probably trying to trick them, right? So notice those two things that happen. Either when they get together with a partner, they, oh, yes, thank you, Con. When they get to with a partner, they then either confirm each other's biases, they confirm each other's thinking, or they slow down and like say, wait a minute, something is wrong here, okay? So here we go. These are, if you've probably seen these in society, right? Like you see a path and you see there's like some green area, and people just kind of walk the way they want to walk, even though there's clearly sidewalks there that have been paved, right? And in urban planning, these are called desire lines, right? It's like, this is the shortest way, I will go this way, and then multiple people do it, and then before you know it, you have a path. I read the story of this one university that they actually had a big green on university, have these big green lawns, and they didn't put down any paths. And they waited until they saw which paths students actually put down, and then they paved over it because they realized, like, we could, do this all day, but people are going to go the line, like take the shortcut that takes them from one place to the other. And this is like a metaphor that I like to use visually for us to think about how bias works, right? The way in which we follow paths that other people have laid forward, that we like to take the shortcut to get from point A to point B. We're not really thinking about it. We don't think we're really intentionally doing anything wrong. We're just following the crowd, or we're just thinking about how to get from one side to the other. And that is sort of when we think about how bias works in our brain. We have two systems. We have the first system, which is intuition and instinct, right? It's fast, it's automatic, associative. This is the system that got you to 10 cents, to 100 widgets, or like, whatever the incorrect answers, right? This is a system that was the fast system that you could feel your brain actually wanting to say a particular answer. And then there was the system 2, which is slow, much more logical and conscious. This is the system sometimes, not always, kicks into gear when you have 2 or more people come to those problems and start actually looking at them more carefully and reading them more carefully, right? We tend to use system 1 95% of the time, right? And then we use system 2 mostly, 5% of the time, right? Our brain, and there are reasons for evolution and, all survival that we have system one. We need to know system. We can't sit and slowly think about when something is like coming towards us that's going to harm us, like a car or a bear or whatever. We don't have, we want to follow. So that's why we have system one for us to survive. But it's also the system that's flawed, right? So I share this really quick example to say that this is how bias works. They're mental shortcuts. We all have them. Bias is neither good nor bad. It's informed by our lived experiences, right? It just happens. Our brain actually doesn't like to do a lot of thinking. Our brain likes to come to quick conclusions as often as possible. We don't actually like to think, right? And so when we say someone is biased, we just all have biases. That's just how it is. And the key is to think about, though, is how these biases, informed by our lived experiences or lack thereof, can lead us to false conclusions, just like in those problems, right? Okay, so some common cognitive biases, and I go over these in the first chapter of the book, because the first chapter of the book is really all about how we teach who we are. Right. So I shared the story earlier of my love of the book, Jane Eyre. Right. And you probably have your own Jane Eyre. We all have these problematic faves from our childhood. And then we watch them again as we become more aware of the world and aware of injustice. And we're like, oh, I can't believe I didn't see that. I can't believe I thought that. Right. We all have our Jane Eyre, whatever it may be. And we have to think about the ways in which we can have those, but then we're bringing them into the class with us. And I'm a better teacher when I can talk to kids about that, when I can acknowledge that there are ways that I've been socialized that could be harmful, right? And they've probably been socialized in ways that could be harmful. And so how do we live outside of that? And how do we choose differently, right? Oh, yes, I just saw someone like John Hughes film. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I had 16 Candles like on repeat in probably when I was too young to be actually watching that, but I had that, picked it up from the store and put it into my VHS player and watched it on repeat, right? But these are the ways that we've been socialized. So we bring that into the classroom. So here are some common cognitive biases that we bring with us, and there's many, many more, but and then in the book, I also have a chart that kind of walks through some of these biases, what they are, how might it affect classroom practices, and then what we can do about it. So I'll start with I'll talk very briefly about them. The curse of knowledge. Curse of knowledge occurs when, if you develop a lot of expertise about something, the irony is you tend to have a harder time explaining it to somebody else. I've experienced this recently with my son, who is learning to drive, right? Driving has become automatic for me. I feel like I'm an expert driver, right? I can, back up. I can, parallel park, I can get it on the first try, everything, me in the car, we are one when I'm behind that driver's wheel, right? But when I have to explain how to drive a car to my son, it becomes very difficult. Part of me just wants to be you just turn it or go this way. And things that feel natural to me are not natural to him. And so the curse of having this knowledge means it makes it harder for me to appreciate a naive perspective, a learning perspective. Think about how we do that in the classroom. So I share in the book too, how, my first year teaching, I thought my kids were brilliant because I was teaching these books for the first time. And because I was teaching books for the first time, every idea that kids had sounded brilliant. It's oh my gosh, that's amazing. You're brilliant, right? But here's the thing with becoming a teacher. When you're a teacher, you become smarter, not just because you teach more years, but also you have more kids. And the more kids you have, the more ideas they bring. And then I would do this thing where, if you're a high school teacher, maybe you've done this before, where you take the idea from a student that said something in first period, and then you say that in second period, because wow, that was a good idea. And then you bring it into second period. And before you know it, you've just not been accumulating your knowledge, but also the knowledge of all the students. So what I found happened after many years is that kids would come into the classroom and they wouldn't have the things that they would say were no longer surprising to me. And so my perspective of them changed a little bit, whereas I saw my first set of kids as brilliant. After 5 years of teaching the same book, no one was saying anything new anymore. And so you develop this sense of like, okay, because I know everything, I have a hard time trying to understand where my kids are coming from, or I don't see their knowledge, what they are bringing, even though it's new to them. It's not new to me, right? So I might dismiss it a bit. We can think about the nostalgia bias, right? This idea of like the good old days and having this rosy outlook. And I can't tell you, and maybe I can ask you right now, like, think about how many times maybe you've heard colleagues or maybe even yourself say things like, well, kids didn't used to be this way. When we think about technology, when we think about their reading abilities, when you think about their interests, things that capture their attention, we might yearn for like the good old days when kids were like this. And then we fail to see that our kids are bringing assets with them right now. The kids we have right now in our classrooms, yeah, maybe they don't know some of the same things that kids from 10, 15 years ago knew, but they have a whole lot of other knowledge that we're maybe not seeing, right? So that nostalgia bias, plus the fact, and if we take another lens at it, demographically, our country is changing, right? We have more kids of color in our classrooms, and we have teachers who've been in the classrooms as well. And we think about the ways in which a yearning for the good old days is also coincides with the good old days in which our student population also demographically looked very different, right? So those are that's a compounding factor on that. The anchoring bias, first piece of information that we have, we get anchored to, and it affects all of our subsequent judgments. So one example of anchoring bias is teachers would like to tell me about students that they had the year before. And they would tell me about, oh, you have so-and-so student, right? Oh, that Tricia, you're gonna love her, or you're gonna watch when you have classroom discussions about X, Y, or Z. Or you might say something like, oh, well, that Matthew, I'll use Matthew because one of my kids' names. He can't write and put together a sentence, like whatever it might be. And I hadn't even met these kids yet. But my view of them was already being anchored to this opinion that a former teacher was giving me, right? And it's been shown, research has been shown that the first piece of information that we have about something tends to impact all subsequent judgments that we have of it, right? Sunk cost fallacy is one where when we put time and effort into something, we are less likely to change, even though it's more logical to change our behavior, but because we've sunk some costs into something, we have to keep going. So the best example of this is for those of you who are like halfway through a book and you really are not liking that book, but you will finish that book because you say to yourself, I'm already 200 pages in, I might as well continue, right? Or you're watching a movie and you're like, this movie is terrible, but you're going to keep watching because you feel like you've already invested, you've sunk some cost into it. And so you don't change. And how does this look in the classroom? Well, it looks like material and curricula that we've created over years. I've already sunk effort into creating whole unit plans on a certain book. And because I've done that, I'm going to keep teaching that book because I already have sunk a lot of resources into that, including my time. And therefore, I'll just keep going that way, right? There's, of course, in-group bias. We have an in-group bias for people who are most like ourselves. I think about as a teacher, I tended to I don't want to say favor, but I tended to feel a kinship with kids who were similar to the types of students that I was. And sometimes I was aware of it and other times I wasn't, right? So how can we always be conscious of that in-group bias that we might have? And then this last one, which I'll just talk very briefly about, but it's this idea of the just world hypothesis. And this idea that I think the best way to put it is what goes around comes around, or you get what you deserve. Right? Like the work that you put out, the effort that you put forward is going to result in, the rewards that you will get, or lack of rewards if you didn't put any effort into something. Right? And we think about kids and we think about the ways in which we might talk about how there's this idea of assumption of fairness in the world, right? That the things that we do in life will come back to us. We put good into the world, we'll be rewarded. If we put, bad into the world, we'll be punished. But we know that's not what it is, right? We might say like, well, and I catch myself with my students, with my own children, actually. Well, if you put them time to study, then you're going to come back and you'll be, all this kind of stuff with grades and so on. And I think the issue, it's not that the just world hypothesis is necessarily wrong, but it doesn't allow for the impact that systemic factors can have in kids' lives, right? Because you can work really hard. And because of things beyond a child's control, that can also impact their achievement. It can impact how they're showing up in the classroom, right? But in our minds, we think, well, this is like, I was fair, right? I gave the same thing to all kids without really thinking about, and that's my assumption, without really thinking about what other factors are at play in each individual student's lives, right? So this just world hypothesis allows us to ignore those systemic things and think that it's just a matter of karma, right? So again, I go into more detail. That was just a very quick little look into some of these, but I think it's important to be aware of these biases so that we can sort of stop, identify them when we see them happening, and then think about how we might interrupt them. All right. Okay, so I'm going to pause and take just a quick moment. If you've been like thinking and like listening, if there's anything right now in the chat that you want to share, something that's resonating with you right now, it's actually, again, this will be good feedback for me as well, so I would appreciate it. Anything that's resonating right now from what we've gone over so far. And I'll look at the chat, see if there's anything here. All right. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Keisha. To be intentional, to avoid those natural biases controlling our actions. Some of us have said, Beth has said, I'm reflecting on different places in my life where the different biases show up. In-group bias, for sure. The tricky thing about the in-group bias is that it actually feels good to do a favor for someone, right? Like when I would, let's say a kid comes to me and says, I need a few more days on my paper, lots going on right now. I have always been the kind of teacher who's like, sure, I'm not going to be upset. I'm glad that you spoke to me. Now I know something about what's going on in your life. I'm always ready to help. And it feels good to do that, right? So the kid who comes up says, I need five more minutes. I need another day, another night to finish my paper. I'm like, okay. And then I feel good about it because it feels good to do that for someone, especially for someone who we share some affinities with, right? In any part of their identity or personality. But the really interesting thing about in-group bias is that we also have to look at the inverse and think about, like, as I favor some, who am I not favoring simply passively, right? For every kid who came to me and asked for like a day, an extra night or 2 nights to finish their paper, I didn't stop and say, well, who am I not giving that time to? Because I bet there were at least 20 other kids that I had in any given year who probably could have also used that extra day, but didn't ask, right? So the in-group bias we have to be aware of too. It's not just who are we favoring, let's say, but who are we not offering, say, the same opportunities out of sort of this sort of passive action, right? Or inaction, right? Okay. So thank you so much. I'm seeing all of these amazing things. Okay, how they see our students. Oh yeah, students ask who favorite students are and so on. And here's the thing, like we are, I used to say this very controversial thing in my classroom, and I used to talk about how, and, I have 3 kids, and I would say about how any given time, one of them is my favorite. And my students would like flip out. They would be like, you can't have favorites. You're supposed to be a parent. And I said, look, a favorite thing isn't about whether or not how much I love them. If you ask any of my children, they all know I love them, just like I love every single one of my students, right? But at any given time, some of them are going to get on my nerves, right? So the key is to, how can we make sure that our kids, each of our kids know that we love them, right? And sometimes giving kids different things based on like a needs level in terms of like an equity lens, what is fair is not always equal, but every single one of them knows that I love them, right? So thinking in those terms. The other way that I want us to think about biases too is from the sort of systems level, cognitive biases. And I saw Kate said something there about the systems level. imagine each individual teacher enacting each of these biases that I just talked about and multiply that. And now you can see why curricula never change. You can see why some practices never change. You can see why dominant modes of thinking and tropes in literature, why they never change, right? Because even though we're all individuals who are in some ways socialized in very similar patterns and therefore just replicating over and over again, right? Another way we can think about bias is the way we interact with kids. And so at my school right now, we have this really great bias checklist. So this is about our interpersonal interactions with kids. So sometimes it's not a matter of necessarily curriculum, but there's also the interpersonal stuff. And here are some questions that I offer that we have posted in teachers' classrooms at my school right now that kind of help when we're looking at a student's behavior and we're asking about and we have to question and stop and question our response to it, okay? So we might look at someone, for example, who's a kid who has their head down. And we might have a biased reaction to a student who has their head down in class. And before jumping to a conclusion about that student who has their head down, we might check the room to see if other students are engaging in the same behavior. We might ask ourselves, do I have all the information, by asking for details before addressing the behavior, right? So if I see a student with their head down, what assumptions am I making about that student? Do I actually have all the information before I go over and say, hey, head up, right? I might assess the impact of publicly acting in the moment versus addressing concerns privately later. I can address my role in the situation. How have I contributed? What is the condition in my classroom? What is the culture of my classroom? What is my role in the situation? Right? And then I might evaluate whether this is a problem worth taking up time and space for. Right? Sometimes I've observed teachers, we each have our own things, pet peeves and so on, where it just gets on our nerves sometimes. And I find that there are times where we have to really consciously understand that that's a me problem and not a student problem. And that sometimes making it a me problem, I make it a them problem when it wasn't a them problem, right? And it's really about me. So we can use this checklist to sort of think about if I'm seeing a behavior, and that behavior can be not turning in their work. That behavior can be interrupting during class. That behavior can be putting their head down. Whatever it might be, we have to sort of zoom out a little bit and stop and ask these other questions as a way to think about how are we treating kids? Are we treating some kids differently based on the biases that we have? All right. So what is anti-bias literacy instruction? And I'm going to close. I've got about 12 minutes left. I'm going to close with some practical strategies that I've used in the classroom. And these are some of the things that I share in the book as well. So we can teach about biases explicitly, right? In my classroom, I had this poster that was about these cognitive biases. We would study them. Kids would actually do mini presentations about biases. Just when you make kids aware of them, they're like, oh, I do that all the time. And the truth is there's no shortage of biases out there in the world. And so kids can start to be aware. So remember, liberatory consciousness, the first step, awareness. Right? So teaching explicitly about these biases. And then we can, second step of liberatory consciousness, analysis. Where is this showing up? So when we would read The Crucible, in the later years that I would teach The Crucible, I would actually, if you've read The Crucible, that that the judges in the story are filled with biases and have all sorts of very specious qualifications for what constitutes evidence, right? And so I would have kids apply the biases to the judge's behavior and to their thinking, right? Where is the faulty thinking? What biases are they bringing? And not just say, oh, they're biased against women. Okay, sure, you can have a bias that way. But what is the actual thought process that is being reflected here in their thinking, in the play's dialogue that we're seeing, right? The judges have a just ruled hypothesis, for example, or the ways in which they're exhibiting confirmation bias, right? Actually seeing it unfold can help kids see it in their own lives and then see it in the literature. We can also think about biases in our literacy practices, right? So in my years of teaching, I thought about what are the dominant practices that we have. If it's a dominant practice, it means we as a profession have a bias for it. Okay, so one dominant practice, for example, is teaching stories of individual heroism over stories of collective action and community. We think about the hero's journey, right? We think about like the individual, like, quote, man versus society, man versus blank, man versus man, right? It's all like this individual versus something else. And I think about like how when we focus so much on individuals, we need to spend and turn our attention to stories of collective action, stories of community, and the interactions between and among characters versus a single character. How we have a bias towards individual effort, and we may think about individual versus, again, all these obstacles they have in their way versus thinking about social context and circumstances, right? How can we start to have kids not just analyze a character's personality, but also the environment and the social context and the historical context of the author in terms of the decision-making that's happening in the story, right? So really being intentional about that. And so you might be aware of, when we think about character development, right? We're familiar with this frame. I used it too. So this idea that a character wants something and that character wants something, that's their motive. And then there's usually some obstacle that's in the way, right? And that's great. That's a great little summary. But then we also have to add in, okay, but what is the context in which this is all happening, right? If Gatsby in The Great Gatsby is changing his name, he wants to be with Daisy, what is the context of the larger society that makes him think that getting access to this old money society is going to give him success, right? What is the context of that time period, right? What is going on here? And we can also think about how our view of stories can change when we move from the traditional plot diagram, right? Individual success. And I've taught this plot diagram. I'm sure many of us have here taught this plot diagram. And how might we look at it differently if we ask ourselves this framework? And this is adapted from Matthew Salesses' book, Craft in the Real World. What if we looked more carefully at the relationship between an individual and society? So I've done these plot diagrams to summarize a book at the end of the book, right? Like here's the start, here's the rising action, climax, and then so on. But what if we looked at any text and we asked, okay, who changes? It's not just a matter of the character changing. We can also ask ourselves, in what ways does the society or community in which that character is a part of change or not change? So I used to teach the book Things Fall Apart. And if you're familiar with that book, then you know that, one of the tragedies in that book with the main character, Okonkwo, who he's stubborn and cannot change, right? He refuses to change, but his society is changing around him, right? Versus you might have a character, or you can actually even think the Crucible, right? We have characters. In what way is the character change? And we might think like, oh, does John Proctor change in that book? Does the society stay the same? Like what's going on here? So we have kids more analyzed. It's not just about a single character that's moving, but it's what is going on in the community and the context. And how does sometimes the failure of a community or context or society's failure to change, how does that actually impact the character versus putting all the responsibility on the individual character? Another one we might think about is prioritizing content, recall after skill application, right? Thinking about, I used to teach books as if they were content versus ways and vehicles into bigger thinking, right? So we have to think about how we might transfer skills. Here is one example of something that I would do. So I have this activity called Circles of Self. I'm just checking the time. Okay, I have like 2 minutes left. I used to have this activity, Circles of Self, and it's based on the Facing History's Universe of Obligation. And I put myself in the middle, and then each circle is like people's relationship to you, right? So in my middle circle, I've got my partner, my kids, my mom and dad, my in-laws, my friends, my squad, etc. And then I have an outer circle. I'm a little bit more further removed, and so on, right? So then like the hotel valet is like over here, the school board of where my sons go to school, like over here, right? Their tennis coach over here, but like my family inside the middle. And we can think about that with books too. We can ask kids to do that for themselves and to understand who is in their circles of obligation. And then we can ask them to think about in any book, who does a author center, marginalize, or who do they miss altogether? I could have done this for Jane Eyre. It's not my example here, but you could see how I did this. I could have put Rochester in the middle, Jane in the middle. You know, Bertha is like all the way over here because she's at the periphery of everything. She doesn't have a voice. She's barely characterized. She's only told from one person's point of view. She doesn't even have real personality traits. She's a static, flat character. I mean, people in the middle here, characters in the middle tend to be dynamic. They tend to be like well-rounded, but over here in the margins, not so much. So we can ask kids to think about books. And then how do these circles change if we take the center of this and we move it to the margin? If we actually center the people who are no longer there. This one, by the way, these characters are from a book called The Things They Carried, if you're not familiar. So how might we design lessons and instruction with these questions in mind, even in our own practices? Every time we make an instructional decision, we think about an activity. Oh, then I'm going to do this cool activity in class. We might ask ourselves, well, who will this activity center? Who might be marginalized doing this activity? And who might be missing? Whose voices might be missing, even unintentionally, as I am presenting this activity, presenting this text set, and so on, right? Who is centered, marginalized, and missing? All right, and really quickly, this is a little bit of a framework here. We start with the reader identity. We look at a text. We think about how our identities might impact our response as readers. We might think about how a character's identities might impact the way a character moves through the fictional world that they're in. And then we ask, what is the relationship of power to all of these interactions, right? Okay, so that is like sort of like the larger framework. And again, this is something that you see unfold, and I go into more detail in the book. All right, so we are at the question stage. And I think, Margaret, we have a few minutes, and I'm not sure how questions will go, if we'll find them or if there's ones here.
I think you referenced most of the questions as they were coming up in the chat, but if anyone has a last minute question, feel free to put it in just as we're about to wrap up. This was wonderful. Such engaging. The chat's been going with conversation. It's been very engaging on obviously very important topic, and even made me think back to my John Hughes and Sweet Valley High days as well.
Oh yeah, John Hughes and Francine Pascal have really done a number of people of a certain age. Margaret, before we go, can I just end with one thing? I have one more thing.
Absolutely.
So as you all leave, I just wanted to end with the last lines from the book, actually, because I want to thank you all for being here. And I'll just end with the last few lines of the book, because it's a wish that I have for all teachers everywhere and all of you that are here. Okay, so, all right. Teachers know about love. When we teach with love, we see each of our kids with the respect and compassion, complexity and messiness that makes them human. When we teach with love, we lead with grace and openness and hope. When we teach with love, we know that our liberation is bound in each other. So if you're reading this book, I hope that it may encourage you to love fiercely, even on days when our grief about the world, when people or systems let us down, seems unbearable. So thank you all for being here. Reach out to me on social media or my website or whatnot if you have any questions. And thank you, Corwin, for having me.